Hello, welcome to the Theatre Royal Nottingham and to the set of A View from the Bridge, the Touring Consortium's latest touring production, which has opened here in Nottingham this week. My name is David Longford. I'm the Creative Learning Manager for the venue, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel discussion looking at the work and legacy of Arthur Miller. And we have quite a distinguished panel for you. So, starting at the end, Dr. Sarah Grandage is the lecturer in language, drama and performance in the University of Nottingham School of English. Prior to this, Sarah trained as an actor and worked in professional theatre for over a decade. She now combines this experience with her research and teaching, ranging from Shakespeare to contemporary drama. Next to Sarah, Dr. Lucy Sutherland. Lucy is a teaching associate in drama and performance in the School of English at the University of Nottingham. Alongside teaching modern and contemporary drama, Lucy has written on many aspects of 19th and 20th century theatre. She's also a theatre reviewer for the TLS. And finally, Stephen Unwin. Stephen is a writer, director and teacher. In the mid-80s, he was associate director at the Traverse in Edinburgh, and then for 15 years from 1993, he founded and ran English Touring Theatre, a pioneering touring company for the UK. From 2008 to 2014, he was artistic director at the Rose Theatre in London. He has written several books about theatre, and I can highly recommend his book, So You Want to Be a Theatre Director, which I have used, Stephen, can I just say. And Stephen is the director of this touring consortium production of A View from the Bridge. This year marks the centenary of Arthur Miller's birth. During his life, he wrote more than 30 plays, his first big success being All My Sons in 1947. His last play, Finishing the Picture, was premiered in Chicago just months before he died in 2005. When he died, Harold Pinter said, "I'm pretty convinced he was writing until the day of his death. He was born with the pen in his hand." In a 1986 interview with the New York Times, Miller states, "All the plays that I was trying to write were plays that would grab an audience by the throat and not release them, rather than presenting an emotion which you could observe and walk away from." Now, to mark this centenary, we are now seeing a plethora of this throat-grabbing work. Last year, the Old Vic produced a revival of The Crucible, starring Richard Armitage. At the end of this month, the RSC present Death of a Salesman, starring Anthony Sher as Willie Loman. In June, Northampton's Roland Derngate and Liverpool Everyman are co-producing the world premiere of The Hook, a play about dockyard corruption, which Miller originally conceived as a screenplay. And then there is A View from the Bridge, both the Old Vic's production in London and this touring consortium production. So, it's been a fairly kind of long-winded route to my first question, but basically, I read the brochure copy on every single show for that, both website and brochure copy, and on all those shows, it states quite clearly, Arthur Miller, the greatest American playwright. Now, is this marketing hyperbole, or is this somewhere near the truth? Sarah.
I think that's a really good question, actually. I have to say, up front, nailing my colours to the mast, I am a rather biased commentator on this, because actually I think that Miller is an extraordinary playwright. One of my main interests is around his facility with language, and I think that's one of the things that makes him an extraordinary playwright. How you rank him amongst other playwrights like Tennessee Williams, David Mamet, who are also, for me, really interesting in terms of the way they use language, I think is a difficult thing. Unless you're asking me, putting me on the spot and asking me to come up with my top 3, in which case I think I probably would put Miller, if not at the top, very near the top. I'm going to go at the top. There you go.
Stephen, you've been working with his play for the last few weeks. Greatest American playwright?
Just stepping away from America for a moment, because, you know, where I put Miller more and more is this weird bastard child of Ibsen and Brecht. It's this peculiar fusion of everything that Brecht understood about how to stage everyday life, the politics of working class experience above all, combining that with Ibsen's understanding of the secrets in the family and of the subconscious and of those inner drives which you don't always understand what they are, and the challenge to be free of those ghosts, if you like. And I think that he sits really interestingly in those two great masters of modern drama. And I think he's the third in some kind of weird triangle. I don't think he quite stands up to either. I don't think he's as good as either of them, but I think he's very, very good. So probably the best American, yeah.
But it's interesting that you place him out of that American, because often, obviously, reading, there's always, and you mentioned Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill is always put in there as well, as alongside that.
Well, I mean,
ranking.
the thing I found directing this play is that, you know, which is set amongst the immigrant Italian community in Red Hook, Brooklyn. You know, New York is the newest European city. I mean, it's extraordinarily European in so many ways. I don't see it in narrow terms as American as opposed to British, if you like. I can see why it's a useful category, but I put him in a kind of in 20th century drama where he fits in that.
Lucy.
Yes, I think I definitely agree, and as Sarah started by saying, that it's very difficult because that idea of ranking American dramatists, there's obviously strengths and merits that come through in a range of different dramatists and their work, but Miller's always mentioned with Williams, with O'Neill and with Edward Albee as well, but it is always Arthur Miller's work that comes back. I know it's a centenary year, but his work is revived repeatedly. There's something about the way that he explores the individual within society, the extent to which the individual is victim in society, the extent to which a kind of tragic form explores how we are prey to society, that I think means he remains quite prominent, quite dominant. And I think for me, and again, it's a very personal judgment, but the only American dramatist that I'd put in the same league for personal preference is someone like David Mamet, whose work seems to tackle quite similar subjects, some of his work does. But also I'd argue that without Miller there would be no Mamet, because plays like Glengarry, Glen Ross are a direct response to plays like Death of a Salesman 30 or 40 years earlier. So Miller for me is right up there.
So you mentioned, Lucy, subject matters in terms of the individual and the kind of the tragic consequences in these plays. I mean, just as a panel generally, what are the other themes and subject matters that you could sort of say are common across Miller's plays? And he did write quite a few.
Actually, I was very struck last night, watching the play, the resonances of some of the lines within View from the Bridge, which they really resonated, having recently seen one of the Crucible revivals. And some of those moments towards the end of the play when Eddie is striving for his name, he is striving for respect. And some of that focus in on the individual and how the individual finds their place in society, how they work with their sense of identity. I think it's something that you see across quite a few of the plays. And I think there's some really interesting things also around ideas to do with law, the law. What does that mean? And lots of things come out within this play around the legal system, but also the other laws that are unspoken, the social codes, the moral laws. And again, you find those cropping up in things like The Crucible. I think there are so many themes that weave through the plays, which I think are really interesting. And part of the reason we keep coming back, I think, to some of these plays, thinking about those issues to do with personal dignity, personal morality, personal responsibility, and characters taking responsibility for their actions. I could go on.
Any other themes that we can pick out from his work that we feel are consistent with there?
Me?
Stephen?
Well, the debate in this play about the law versus the individual, it goes right back to Antigone. I mean, it's very, very ancient. Do you obey the law or do you obey your own conscience, your own belief system, if you like? And the two are then are in tragic conflict with each other. And the thing that I find with Miller all the time is that there is this, what is the lie, what's the dream that we're being sold, and why is the lie, the dream, not particularly the American dream, if you like, actually not true? You see, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about this play, which is sometimes talked of as a Greek tragedy, as I've just done, it's a tragedy of the little man. It's of the man working on incredibly unsafe working conditions, 0 hours contracts. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Absolutely terrible pay, living in poverty. I mean, Red Hook, where it's set, is still one of the poorest parts of the United States. And I think it's fascinating. And Miller had worked there on the docks. And I think it's in this interesting combination of absolutely specific social circumstances, which I think you can't ignore in the plays, the combination of that with some sense of a Greek tragedy and of something grander set behind it, set in it like a shadow behind it. But I think one has to deal with the social conditions of the people in the plays, whether it's a salesman flogging around America or a poor guy working the docks. I think one of the most beautiful lines in the play, sorry, I'm talking too much. The most beautiful lines in the play is, it looks like it's going to rain. It'll be slippery on the decks tomorrow. Mm. These are guys who working on ships without proper helmets and that's so beautiful, that. It's so extraordinary that there's a great playwright going to write about that part of life as well.
Lucy, is there anything you want to add?
Well, really, just, I think, building on that, the idea that because of that social context and those very particular conditions that we see this individual man in particular, but as representative of those particular social conditions, we see him suffering through and having to exist through. It is a reminder, I think, and this is something else that Miller is fascinated in, and that morality is relative to your situation. Morality is not that clear-cut, and that social contexts and the pressures of society complicate moral certainties. And I think that's something as well he's trying to throw out to the audience, this idea that, you know, just be careful with the judgments you make. And in this play, there's obviously qualities to Eddie's character that make you kind of at least initially judge him, but then you realise morality is relative and complex and related to social context. So I think that really interests Miller in his drama.
That's the nature of the realism, and it is realistic drama, I'm absolutely convinced. Not entirely naturalistic, but it is realistic drama. It's all the time saying, ideals, yeah, right. Absolutes, yeah, right. Morality, it's all relative, entirely relativistic, which is very, very impressive.
He sets that up, doesn't he, again and again within the plays. Yeah. I think it's so tempting to want a black and white answer, to want to say, these are the good people, these are the bad people, these people are good because, these people are bad because. And actually it's quite hard in the majority of cases to pinpoint good and bad in those very black and white terms, because he sets up that sense of the context. He sets up that sense of all these things exist on a sort of continuum, as it were, and there's so much of a sense of it depends on the way you look at it, it depends on your perspective. And I think that's one of the reasons they're so powerful, is they don't set themselves up as a right and wrong answer. They allow a degree of debate, don't they?
Yeah.
Fascinating thing in this play, which I think makes it ridiculously relevant, and I'm not particularly seeking out relevance. This is a play about immigration. This is a play about immigration, and there are two immigrants who come in, illegal immigrants, who come in under the wire, and they have got the biggest, most positive contribution to be made to the United States. And the people who are there are the people who are in trouble. So Marco and Rodolfo, Marco, who works and works and works and works, like immigrants coming into this country, 99% of them work incredibly hard. And Rodolfo comes in and has got talent and energy and appeal and attractiveness. And I think that's absolutely fascinating that there it is. You know, play for our time.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about Miller as a man of the theatre, really. I mean, Stephen, you mentioned Greek theatre. He seems to absolutely understand theatre in terms of its history, its role, and its purpose. And obviously, you know, a recommended read would be Time Bends, Arthur Miller's autobiography, and he talks about obviously what happened to his family in the Depression. His brief work with the New Deal and the Federal Theatre Project. He clearly saw how theatre could address issues and been through the issue. And I just wondered, a small quote from Miller was that he felt his work should be heard and not read. And I just forgot to start with the two academics at the end there, in terms of those who were teaching Miller. If you a response to that, really.
Do you want to take that?
I think, absolutely. I think there's no doubt when you read his own words on theatre and creating theatre, not just his plays, but actually both the plays and his writings provide the same message, that obviously you can put down in textual form some of your ideas, and indeed as teachers as well as researchers, we absolutely do get our students to read these plays, but what is always absolutely crucial to remember is that there is a very different sensory experience between sitting in a room on your own, reading a play text, or perhaps Miller's biography, and actually having the crucial shared experience of theatre. So I think what Miller fervently believed was that through performance, these ideas can be a confrontation, if you like, to your audience, not necessarily in the kind of excessive and overt way that happens in a Brecht play, although I know you're acknowledging that Brechtian influence may be there in part, but any live performance event where the performers and the audience are sharing that space, there is to some extent a dialogue being set up. And even if in a piece of realist theatre, that's not asking for a very active audience, it's still asking for the audience to take on board the questions that are provided through performance and provided to an audience as a collective, saying you are representing society in this theatre, you are receiving this drama, and I'm telling you we need to think about the state we're in. So in 1950s America, the state we're in, what's happening with moral certainties, what's happening with immigration. So that shared quality, I think, is something Miller was absolutely passionate about, which you can't get from just reading.
It's that throat grabbing again, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Stephen, I just wonder, as a director and somebody who's, as I sort of say, who's just been so engaged with this play, just is that understanding of theatre that Miller had, does that come across to you straight away?
Yeah. But he's like all the great playwrights. All the great playwrights, the theatre understand the way the theatre works. When I teach Shakespeare, I always shock students by saying the greatest writing in the English language was written to be heard, not read. And people are always a bit surprised. You mean, well, Dickens was written to be read, but actually Shakespeare was written to be heard. And I think that's the same with this stuff. I think the other thing that happens is, going back to your point about the relativism, is that you can read a Miller play, or any great play, and you take out a speech and you think that's what Miller is saying. But of course it's all it's all set up of conflict and contradiction, and none of it is what Miller is thinking. What Miller may be thinking, if I knew where he was, Arthur, can you hear me, is a drama which is full of opposites, full of contradiction, full of conflict. And through those opposites, something is communicated. But I mean, I'm often struck by how the quality of the language which is spoken. There's a beautiful phrase that happens 2 or 3 times in this place. You'll get a blessing for this, for that. You'll get a blessing. It's extraordinary. The thing I think about this play more and more, I'm half Catholic, half Jewish, and guilty, is as I think Miller was. This is the most Catholic work of art I've ever come across, apart from, Piero della Francesca. It's extraordinarily Catholic, and he's writing about, and there's the Holy Family in the middle of it, and so on and so on and so forth. There's an amazing moment, I'm sorry, I'm off tan, here we go, but anyway, there's an amazing moment when Catherine says, he's awful, he's terrible, he's dreadful. And the mother says, well, not her mother, but the wife, she says, no, we're all guilty. We're all guilty, which is just brilliant Catholic doctrine. There, boom, straight out. We're all guilty. Don't think that you have the monopoly on judgment, is what you're saying about the relativism, which I think is fabulous. And it just keeps running through it all the time. And he keeps doing that in 3 dimensions. The family sit down to the meal and eat. Yeah. It's sort of everywhere, wherever you look. Sometimes I find its theatrical form, somebody coming forward and speaking straight to the audience, when he did it, must have felt extraordinary. Of course, Shakespeare did it, and the classical theatre has always done it. But it must have felt extraordinary that somebody breaks the 4th wall. And now it's less surprising, shall we say.
I'm sensing, Stephen, once again, as a mark of a kind of great playwright. Obviously, you've been engaged with this play for some time now and spent a lot of time with that script, but you're still finding fresh things in it. You're still coming out, which once again is a mark of a great play and a great writer. If
I directed it again in a year's time, it would be completely different. But because it's a very, very really good plays open themselves up every time you do it. They're different. Yeah.
And I think part of that opening up comes from the language, doesn't it? And those ideas of the kind of sort of indeterminacies around what does it mean. I think one of the things that I think about quite a lot around Miller's work is the way for me, he's such a wordsmith in terms of the way he uses language so beautifully, working on the levels of language. So he works with that sort of surface level, the idea of the sort of denotative meaning of words, but then he's always playing with the connotations. And this, actually thinking about what you're saying about the sort of Catholic nature of the play, some of the imagery that crops up I think is really interesting around the way Eddie refers to Catherine. Madonna, exactly. And there's some really interesting thematic ideas around that. But that is balanced with the way he talks about her as little girl, baby, you've got to be a big girl now. And there's a really, really interesting tension there, isn't there, between that idea of the sort of idealised daughter and the Madonna figure and what's happening in his relationship with Beatrice. And all it is these tiny little words around naming conventions and how you refer to somebody. And the things you almost don't notice, that he just drops them here and there. And it's only when you realise that there's a kind of, as you say, you can't take something out and look at it in isolation. It all works together.
But you see, as a son of Ibsen, she gets called, you're a Madonna, you're my little girl, you're my baby, all this kind of stuff. But by the end, she's saying, you're a rat, you belong in the gutter, and I hate you. Before Beatrice tells her off that she's also guilty, but that's another problem. So that there is the struggle for freedom, there is the struggle for independence, for autonomy, for living your own life, which is what Catherine, bless her, is trying to do. And Eddie is trying to stop. He can't bear that she's growing up, that old problem.
He has that great line, doesn't he, about the one thing I never thought about was that you would grow up.
That you
I
would
never
ever grow up.
imagined that.
Yeah. So that's where you see, and this is what I mean about, there's Ibsen, if you like, and then it's Brecht, because Ibsen set all his plays in middle-class drawing rooms. And then there's Brecht, because it's a guy working on zero-hours contracts, unloading ships in Red Hook, says that, and is dealing with that problem.
I think what as well is very distinctive about this play, because although people talk broadly about Miller as being a realist dramatist, the balance you get here between the more Ibsenesque qualities and that focus upon heredity, upon environment, and all that fine detail in the language. But then, of course, it's framed or it's surrounded by the lawyer figure, by Alfieri, who is there. And again, and this is the Brechtian component that really draws attention, if you like, in a very particular way to the realism, saying, stop now, think about what you've just seen, think about that realist moment. It kind of calls attention to itself. So we're not allowed to become too immersed for the entire play in the intricacies of the characters. We also have to engage quite critically. And I think that's really quite distinctive in this. I think very rich drama.
It is the product of its age. It's 1956, isn't it? And there are moments when you go, God, this is a play from a very long time ago, actually, I must say. Yeah.
Which bit in particular that you feel dated?
I suppose the very notion of this male tragedy feels a bit dated somewhere.
Okay.
I suppose somewhere. Funny, we had an audience this afternoon with a lot of young people, and they were having a good time, but you could feel a little bit of why couldn't they all just crack open and go off their own different way? And because the claustrophobia of that world, the community, the sense of narrow community, is quite difficult for people. I think it's quite difficult for people to really engage with now.
And I think there is a particular focus on masculinity, which is still very productive. But I think it's of that era where, rumour has it that to some extent, as a play, it's a response to Kazan's On the Waterfront, because the different ways in which Elia Kazan and Arthur Miller approach McCarthyism, and Kazan creating a film about, that's one view of being an informer, and then A View from the Bridge is quite another view on what happens if you end up as informer for whatever reason. But both films deal with masculinity and a very particularly 1950s idea of changing concepts around masculinity and gender.
And often the Crucible is seen as that reaction to the Hewitt trials. Well, actually View from the Bridge as well is important to see into that canon.
He's a socialist playwright. And I think one has to really acknowledge that he's a figure from the left. And I slightly react against it's universal and timeless Greek tragedy, although I understand Miller's aspiration to that. But it really is about how do people who have very little, how do they gain their dignity in life? And there are these wonderful things where there are lots of positives: family, love, affection, reasonableness, music, sex, food, all the good things. And then there's this terrible thing which destroys people, which is out there and is terrible working conditions and terrible housing conditions and poverty. I'm very, very struck by it more and more. That's all.
I think it's time for some questions from the audience. We have some roving microphones, you'll be delighted to know. So, and I see that we've got some students who've kind of crept in at the back as well, which is, hello, welcome. So I'm sure you've got lots of questions. So if you've got a question, please put your hand up and the microphone will be coming your way. So lady in the white there, and then we'll move to the lady in the front there. So if you just wait for the microphone to come and ask us your question.
Sorry. So from when you first read the play, has your interpretation changed at any point? Because obviously ideas such as Rodolfo's intentions or Eddie's love for Catherine can be debatable. So has your interpretation changed from first reading the play?
Yeah, it changes almost every 5 minutes. I mean, I presume that was for me. Yeah. I mean, I've seen the play a few times before, and when I was asked to do it, I read it. But then you start rehearsing it, and you discover more and more and more. And I watched it this afternoon, and I was thinking, oh, that and that. It never stops. I mean, the mistake is to imagine that a director comes in and goes, this is how it works. I started with, I said, there are 3 things that matter. Poverty, Italian Catholicism, and immigration. And I still think those are the things that really, really matter in the play. Those are the things that drive the engines, if you like, to my mind. But beyond that, it's all nuance. It's all changes all the time. It develops all the time. It gains in richness, I hope.
Yes, and there's a lady just in the front here.
My son was absolutely bowled over when he saw Death of a Salesman. And several years later, I said, well, what did it teach you? And he said, it teaches me that nothing ever changes. Do you think Miller would like things to change? Is that why he writes, or is it just for fun?
Well, is that for me or for anybody else?
Anybody on the panel?
I think there's something quite interesting, just thinking about some of the things we've been talking about here, and that's a really interesting question, because I think one of the things that he's fascinated by in this play is, and again going back to that idea of the kind of nuances of language, the title of the play itself, the idea of the view from the bridge, obviously the Brooklyn Bridge, but also there's that idea of linking Brooklyn back to Sicily. There's the idea of the new world and the old world. And some of what happens within the play with Eddie's, that fate that he is driving towards, there's a sense, I think Miller talks about it in some of his essays on theatre, he talks about that is driven by that myth-like connection to the past, to the ancient Greek tragedy. This is the tragedy of a common man rather than a king, but there is something that is sort of inescapable at some level, and that we keep making the same mistakes, we keep repeating some of these ideas. And I think he's noting that and putting it forward to us and saying, you are responsible for your own actions, we all are responsible for our own actions, but we keep making the same mistakes, in different contexts, in different ways, but we keep doing it. What do you think? So I think he sets it up for us as almost as a question, actually.
He's trying. He's giving us the chance to have another go at things.
Well, I think he's trying to write, and occasionally too self-consciously, he's trying to write modern tragedy. But modern tragedy has this driving energy which leads to the catastrophe. But Antigone and Creon in Antigone are diametrically opposed, and they're both right. The law and the individual are both right. So I don't think it's quite as simple as that nothing ever changes. I think it's that there are these tragic patterns in life which are ghastly. But I mean, this play offers so many opportunities for Eddie not to make them, to stop making mistakes. And he always makes the mistake, always a beat late. And that's awful. That, I think, is about education and all kinds of other, So I don't quite buy your son's analysis, but I think that there's a tragic drive. But tragic isn't just, oh yeah, it always happens, so what we're going to do about it.
I think as well, in a very, very practical sense, you mentioning Death of a Salesman reminds me there's a parallel with this play, with A View from the Bridge, in that we're left at the end of each play with 2 young men, and we can see that their lives might go in quite different directions. So we're left with Willy Loman's 2 sons, one of which it's very likely he will end up like his father. But here we end up with Marco and Rodolfo, and we're not quite sure what their futures will hold. But they're very different individuals and there are very different possibilities there. So the possibility of change through the next generation, but also because it's tragic drama on one level, this dreadful fear that that change won't come into being. So,
or it won't come in time.
Yes.
There's those
It won't
ideas, aren't there?
It won't come in time for Eddie, but it will come in time for Catherine and Rodolfo's children.
Yes, maybe.
You know, King Lear has got a happy ending. Actually, there is a possibility of a reformed state.
Is there
I think so.
Any other questions? Yes, lady in the middle there with the scarf.
I mean, in addition to the three main themes that you've talked about, I mean, it strikes me that the eternal tragedy is of the older generation within a family witnessing the younger generation going beyond them and out of their control. And clearly, Eddie is distraught at the fact that he inevitably loses control of Catherine. And however complicated his relationship with her, whether it's father-daughter, whether it's more complicated than that, is up for debate. But he senses he is going to lose, and they will be left as the older generation with youth growing away from them. And that's perennial.
I think that's absolutely bang on. Yeah. Well done, thank you.
Anybody else? Even anybody at the back there, if you want to.
Anybody at the back?
Yes, gentleman at the front here.
Yes, one of the things that hit me in the stomach, and I hadn't noticed, I've seen the play several times, but it hit me today, was when Marco said, "You have killed my wife and my children." And he hadn't, they weren't dead, but he was sort of forecasting the future, wasn't he?
Well, what that's about is that by working there, he can send the money home. And because we hear at the beginning that one of the boys is dying of tuberculosis. I mean, the south of Italy, after the Second World War, the level of poverty was just absolutely astronomical. In Naples in 1945, 1 in 8 women, I think this is true, worked in prostitution. I mean, the level of poverty is just astounding. There was no work. Nothing, as Rodolfo said. Okay. And people were dying of starvation. So this isn't just economic. He's not just being hyperbolic. He's telling the truth that now he's been thrown out of the country, the kids will die.
I think there's a really great thing that I was struck by watching it yesterday, actually, that difference between Marco and Rodolfo. So Marco, we hear about, he works hard, he saves money, he sends it home. Yeah. That is his focus, is back in the old country. His new family, but back in the old country. Whereas one of Eddie's problems with Rodolfo is that he's frivolous. He doesn't seem to be saving money. Actually, he tells Catherine, doesn't he, that he's got $300, I think. But he appears not to be planning for the future in this new country or thinking about what he's left behind. He's living in the moment. And I think that's one of Eddie's problems with him a little bit, isn't it? Yeah. And there's something really interesting, I think, when you see those two brothers, where they're anchored in the past, in the future, in the here and now, in the old country, in the new country, and what's happening. And that line of Marco's is really sort of heartrending, isn't it? About
heartrending.
You've killed my family.
And that extraordinary moment when he first arrives and says, "My wife." My wife. You know, this is everything for him and his 3 kids. I mean, you mentioned the bridge across the sea. I mean, that sense of something so foreign arriving. And I love that moment when he says to Beatrice, "Are you my cousin?" I've never met you before. Are you my cousin? It's so phenomenal. And that distance.
And yet the family tie that sort of draws them together across that distance.
But again, it's linking the family to the broader kind of social environment and actually internationally. Yeah. And it's a kind of a marker of Miller's brand of socialism, I think, because although Marco is talking about his wife and his children, what those lines do is they rip you out of you know, the pity for Eddie that you can see his tragedy coming, but you're being reminded the implications of what's happening here are so vast, and we're not to forget that as an audience.
And you see, poverty is a relative concept, because I was saying earlier that Eddie and the family is living in poverty. They are living in serious poverty, but they're living in Brooklyn. Now, it is poverty, but it's nothing compared with where Marco and Rodolfo come from, which is abject, you know, developing third world. So it is very like the Bulgarians and the Romanians. It's the same deal. It's extraordinary, I think.
We need to start wrapping this up because there's another show on it. But yes, of course. Could you just wait for the microphone? Yes, far away.
When you cast a play like this and your actors start to say their words or read their, do you find that they start to take on the character in a way that you might not have imagined? Or do you direct exactly how you want that character played?
No. No, the great illusion about directing is that there's any power in it. You're watching what you're watching what they do, and you're steering them through. Somebody memorably said, "You're steering actors through the minefield of their own best intentions." Okay, you're helping them. You're reflecting back on them on what they're doing, and what I'm doing all the time is I'm going, "Well, what does it say in the play?"
Yes, back to the script.
Back to the play, you know.
One of the things, just to round up, one of the things I wanted to look at in this discussion was a legacy. I mean, Sarah, we talked about, you mentioned the fact that obviously, yes, it's the Miller's centenary, we're seeing all these revivals, but he's an often revived playwright anyway. That is legacy enough. Are there the Arthur Millers of today? Are there the writers out there who are grabbing our throats, who are using the theatre as a tool for, you know, confronting us and so on? Are they out there?
Do you know, I think this is a really interesting question around the theatre landscape of today. Mm-hmm. I think there are all sorts of things that there is a part of me that wants to say, I don't know. Partially because I think the kind of drama that Miller writes, that sort of inexorable, tragic trajectory that the plays have, a lot of writing that I look at today, a lot of contemporary writing, seems to be a little bit more episodic, shall we say. And the other thing that strikes me in terms of one of the differences is I think Miller writes about things that are less issue-based. So a lot of contemporary playwrights are writing about things like immigration or the war on terror or gender identity, let's say. They're taking an issue, and that is what the play appears to be about. Whereas Miller actually writes within such a bigger, richer context. I think there's something quite different about the theatre landscape at this stage in the 21st century. And I also think, just in terms of the way theatre is made, the rise of the ensemble devised piece is also quite interesting, that we seem to be in a period where writing is different, but also the way theatre is created is different. So the writers are creating more issue-based, episodic theatre, perhaps, those who are working on political theatre. But also there is the rise of the theatre of the devised ensemble, where the writer actually is working in a slightly different way, the director is working in a slightly different way to create theatre. And I think it would be really interesting to see what would happen if Miller were alive today, with the impetus that drove him to write the plays of the 1940s and 50s. Because we do have a political climate that demands a certain response. And I'd really like to see, in that little time travel moment, what it would be like if he was writing plays like Death of a Salesman, View from the Bridge, in today's context. What would those plays be?
Because in fact he did start his career writing for, work for Federal Theatre, work with group theatre, or engagement with group theatre in New York. And it's one of those unanswerable questions, really, of, how might, where are the Millers of today? How might Miller engage with the contemporary political scene? I mean, I do find myself seeing plays and thinking about Arthur Miller, which is obviously, and it just demonstrates his influence and his continued pervasiveness. So this might sound really quite eccentric, but in seeing and then teaching a play like Jerusalem, the kind of Jez Butterworth, very recent modern British dramatist, putting an older male figure at the heart of a drama and saying, what does this tell us about the state we're in, the nation we're in? What does this figure, Rooster, in Jerusalem tell us about England right now? I saw that and I was reminded of Miller. And so in thinking about today, I was thinking about that play a lot. But that doesn't mean that Butterworth is like Arthur Miller. But yeah.
Stephen, any thoughts?
I think any time anybody tries to create a piece of theatre, whether it's written or devised or whatever else, which is kind of engaging in the complexities of human life and of human beings in the world, they're working in a tradition that goes right back. The form will keep changing. The form will always keep changing, and that's right that it does. You know, in some ways, this is quite old-fashioned, and I'm aware of that. But the key question, I think, is, are people who create theatre interested enough in what happens outside of the theatre? And if they can be really interested in what's happening outside of the theatre, they might be able to continue the great tradition, if you like. Because you sort of feel Miller's going, yeah, theatre schmearter, I want to know what's going on in the docks.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. Thank you to my colleagues in the Touring Consortium and at the Theatre Royal for allowing us to stage this. Thank you to Confetti, and thank you most to our panel. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.